My name is Ibrahim Traore. I serve as the president of Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in West Africa where the soil is dry, the sun is strong, and the hopes of millions of people remain alive despite generations of hardship. I was not born into wealth or privilege. I grew up like many children in Africa, surrounded by stories of struggle, but also by stories of faith. In my childhood home, the name of Jesus Christ was spoken with reverence. My elders believed that leaders are not only chosen by people, but also tested by God. As I grew older, I came to understand that leadership is not simply about power, it is about responsibility. Every decision a leader signs can shape the future of millions who may never even know his name. This is why the events I am about to share with you still weigh heavily on my heart. On the 8th day of March, I traveled to Washington, D.C. in the United States. The purpose of the visit was an important meeting held at the headquarters of the International Monetary Fund. Representatives from the IMF, the World Bank, and several large global financial institutions were present. Leaders and ministers from multiple African nations were invited as well. The meeting room was filled with economists, advisors, diplomats, and project planners. The atmosphere felt serious but hopeful. That day, they presented what they described as one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the history of Africa. It was called the Trans-Africa Highway Corridor. According to their proposal, the highway would stretch across roughly 10,200 kilometers. The road would connect 12 African nations across the continent, forming a continuous route from West Africa to East Africa. Countries such as Senegal, Mali, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya would be linked through a single transportation artery. The proposed initial investment was $92 billion. To many of us in that room, the presentation sounded like the beginning of a new chapter for Africa. The IMF analysts showed us charts, projections, and digital maps. They spoke confidently about the future that this highway could create. They explained that transportation costs across Africa could fall by as much as 35 to 45%. They predicted that goods traveling from the western coast of the continent to the eastern ports could move in 6 days instead of 18. They estimated that trade between African nations could more than double. Factories would rise along the road, farms would export their crops more easily, tourists could travel across the continent, and according to their projections, the project could generate more than 3 million jobs. As we listened, many of us felt something we had not felt in a long time. Hope. For generations, Africa has struggled with limited infrastructure. Roads that should connect nations often stop at borders. Trucks carrying goods sometimes spend weeks traveling distances that should take days. This highway, they told us, would change everything. I remember looking around the room at other African leaders. Some nodded quietly, others whispered to their advisors. In that moment, it seemed possible that Africa might finally step onto a new path of development, a path toward independence from poverty, a path toward dignity for our people. But what happened later that night would change the way I saw that project forever. And it began with a dream I could not ignore. That afternoon in Washington, when the presentation ended, the room filled with a quiet but powerful energy. Many of us had traveled thousands of miles to attend that meeting. Some had flown overnight across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying with them the weight of their nation's expectations. And for a moment, it felt as though we were standing at the doorway of a new future. I remember the large screen at the front of the room. On it was a digital map of Africa. A glowing line stretched across the continent, beginning near the Atlantic coast and running through the heart of our lands toward the Indian Ocean. The line looked simple on the screen, but to us it represented something much greater. For decades, Africa had suffered from a problem that outsiders rarely understood fully. The continent is rich in resources, rich in people, and rich in culture. Yet moving goods across it has always been slow and expensive. A truck carrying agricultural products from West Africa to East Africa might spend nearly 3 weeks on the road. Sometimes the delays came from poor infrastructure, sometimes from damaged roads, sometimes from border checkpoints that were not coordinated between neighboring nations. The result was the same. Trade within Africa remained painfully low. The IMF analysts explained this very clearly in their report. At that time, only around 15% of Africa's trade occurred between African nations themselves. The rest depended heavily on shipping goods to Europe, Asia, or North America. That imbalance had trapped the continent in a cycle for generations. Africa exported raw materials outward and imported finished goods back at higher prices. But the experts presenting the highway plan told us that this project could break that cycle. They projected that the Trans-Africa Highway Corridor could raise intra-African trade from roughly 15% to more than 30%. To many of us, that number alone felt revolutionary. Because when nations trade with each other, industries grow, factories open, jobs appear. The presenters continued explaining the potential economic transformation. They showed projections suggesting that transportation costs across the region could drop by as much as 45%. That would mean farmers in Burkina Faso could move their crops to markets in Ghana, Nigeria, or Sudan at far lower cost. Mineral resources from Mali or Chad could reach manufacturing centers faster. Fresh agricultural goods could travel across borders before spoiling. Even tourism could expand. Imagine, they said, travelers driving across Africa along one continuous modern highway, crossing cultures, landscapes, and histories in a way that had never been possible before. They also predicted that the construction itself would create millions of jobs. According to the report, more than 3,200,000 positions could be generated across multiple industries. Construction workers, engineers, suppliers of building materials, small businesses serving workers along the route. For countries where youth unemployment was painfully high, those numbers carried enormous meaning. I looked across the table at fellow African leaders. Some leaned forward with excitement. Others took careful notes. Many of us had spent years struggling to attract large-scale development projects. Yet here, suddenly, was a proposal that promised transformation across the entire continent. It was difficult not to feel inspired. One official from the World Bank spoke passionately about how the corridor could support agriculture. He described vast farming regions across West Africa that currently struggled to export crops because of transportation cost. With a modern highway, he said, farmers could move produce quickly across borders, reaching millions of new customers. Another expert explained how mining industries could expand. Africa holds some of the world's largest reserves of minerals essential for modern technology. Gold from Ghana, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, uranium from Niger, copper from Zambia. But without efficient transportation networks, many of those resources remained underdeveloped. A highway linking regions together could unlock enormous economic potential. They also spoke about industrial zones. According to the proposal, multiple manufacturing hubs could be developed along the highway corridor. Factories would process raw materials locally rather than exporting them abroad. Young people would find work closer to their homes. Communities would grow around these new economic centers. Every projection they showed seemed to point in the same direction: growth, opportunity, development, and perhaps most importantly, dignity. For generations, Africa had been portrayed as a continent dependent on outside assistance. Yet here was a vision suggesting that Africa could build a powerful internal market. I remember thinking about the people back home in Burkina Faso, farmers who worked under the harsh sun every day, families who struggled to transport their harvests to larger markets, young men and women searching for employment opportunities. What if this highway truly created the changes we were being promised? What if the road that appeared on that glowing screen actually became a bridge connecting Africa's potential to its future? The more I listened, the more hopeful I became. I was not alone. During a short break in the meeting, several African delegates gathered near the windows overlooking the city of Washington. The conversations were filled with cautious excitement. Some leaders spoke about how their nations could finally move goods efficiently across borders. Others imagined regional cooperation expanding in ways that had never been possible before. There was even talk that such infrastructure could strengthen political unity across the continent. For decades, Africa had talked about integration. Now, it seemed that a physical network could help make that dream real. But there was something else in the room that day, something subtle, something I did not notice clearly at the time. While the African leaders spoke about opportunity, the financial institutions spoke carefully about financing structures, loan agreements, and long-term operational frameworks. Those conversations were more technical, more complicated. At first, I assumed they were simply normal parts of any large project. After all, building a highway stretching more than 10,000 kilometers would naturally require complex financial arrangements. But looking back now, I realized that some of the most important details were hidden inside those technical explanations. At the end of the day, we returned to our hotels carrying folders filled with documents, feasibility studies, economic projections, draft agreements. The official plan suggested that the first phase of construction would require an investment of approximately $92 billion. The financing would come from a mixture of international loans, development funds, and private investors. To many of us, the scale of the number was overwhelming. Yet the presenters assured us that the projected economic growth would make the investment worthwhile. They spoke confidently. They spoke with the authority of global institutions that had shaped financial systems for decades. And so most of us left the meeting believing that we had witnessed the beginning of something historic. That evening, I returned to my hotel room in Washington. The city outside the window glowed with lights. Cars moved along wide American roads that had been built generations earlier. Those roads had helped create the economic power of the United States. Perhaps now, Africa would finally build its own network. I remember sitting quietly in the room, thinking about the responsibility that comes with leadership. When a leader signs an agreement of that size, he is not only approving a project, he is shaping the future of millions of lives. That night, I believed I had witnessed a plan that could help lift Africa forward. But later, as sleep finally came to me, something happened that I could never have expected. A dream that would change everything. And that dream began with light. That night in Washington, I lay down in a hotel room that felt strangely quiet. The city outside the window was still alive. I could hear distant traffic, the faint hum of engines moving along the wide American streets. The lights of the Capitol glowed against the dark sky. But inside the room there was only silence. The day had been long. My mind was full of numbers, projections, and conversations from the meeting. $92 billion, 10,200 kilometers of highway, millions of jobs, lower transportation costs, a new era for Africa. Those ideas moved through my thoughts like waves that refused to settle. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into sleep. At first, my sleep was ordinary, the kind of deep, quiet rest that follows a day of heavy responsibility. But then, something changed. I found myself standing in a space that was neither my hotel room nor any place I recognized. There was darkness all around me. Not the darkness of night, but something deeper. A silence so complete that it seemed the world itself had stopped breathing. Then suddenly a light appeared. At first it was distant, like a small star shining through fog. But the light grew brighter, stronger. It spread through the darkness until the space around me was filled with a warm glow. The light did not hurt my eyes. It felt calm, almost peaceful. And then I saw a figure within it. A man standing inside the light. He wore a long white robe that moved gently as if touched by wind, though the air around us remained perfectly still. His hair was long and brown, falling around his shoulders. His face was kind, yet there was something powerful in his expression, something that carried both mercy and authority at the same time. In that moment, I understood who stood before me. Jesus Christ, the name that had been spoken in my childhood home, the name I had heard in churches across Africa, the name millions of believers around the world still whisper in prayer. In the dream, I did not feel fear. Instead, I felt a deep sense of gravity, as if I had been called into a moment that mattered far beyond my own life. Jesus did not speak immediately. He simply looked at me. His eyes were steady, focused, and filled with a seriousness that made my heart beat faster. It felt as though he could see every thought I had carried into that meeting earlier that day. Every hope, every doubt, every decision waiting to be made. The silence between us lasted only seconds, yet it felt longer. Then he raised his hand slightly, and the space around us changed. The light remained, but now images began to appear within it. Not like pictures on a screen. They looked more like windows into another time, another future. I realized that he was about to show me something I needed to see. Before the first image appeared clearly, Jesus finally spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that seemed to echo through the entire space. He did not shout. He did not command. Yet every word felt impossible to ignore. Ibrahim, he said gently, a leader must learn to see beyond promises. The moment those words reached me, the light shifted again. The first vision began to form before my eyes, and what I saw next would stay with me forever. When Jesus finished speaking those few words, the light around us grew stronger. It did not blind me, but it filled the space with a clarity that felt almost sacred. Then the first vision appeared. At first, I saw the continent of Africa from high above, as if I were looking down from the sky. The land stretched wide and beautiful, filled with deserts, forests, rivers, and villages scattered across enormous distances. Then slowly, something new appeared across that landscape. A highway, A long modern road cutting across the continent from west to east. It was wide and smooth. Bright lights lined parts of it. Trucks moved along its lanes in long lines, carrying containers from one side of Africa to the other. From a distance, the road looked like progress. It looked like development. It looked exactly like the highway we had been shown earlier that day in Washington. For a brief moment, I thought the vision was confirming the promise we had been given. But then the scene moved closer. What I saw next began to trouble me. The road itself was modern and impressive, but the communities surrounding it looked unchanged. I saw villages made of fragile materials, homes with metal roofs patched together by families struggling to survive. Children stood beside dusty paths, watching the large transport trucks rushing past them. The trucks carried valuable cargo, but those children were barefoot. They looked thin. Some held empty containers waiting for water deliveries that came only occasionally. The road was rich. The people beside it were still poor. The vision shifted again. Now I saw enormous transport convoys moving across the highway. Containers marked with international shipping logos moved in steady streams across the continent. Goods flowed rapidly from mining regions to coastal ports. Yet in the villages nearby, farmers struggled to sell their harvests. Their small trucks could not easily access the highway. The toll stations along the road charged fees too high for many local traders to afford. So while massive corporate shipments traveled efficiently across Africa, local economies remained trapped in the same difficulties they had always faced. The contrast was painful to witness. The highway had become a corridor for wealth, but the wealth did not belong to the people living beside it. Then the first vision faded slowly into the light. Before I could fully understand what I had seen, the second vision appeared. This time, the setting was different. I found myself inside a large government building somewhere in Africa. The room looked official. Long tables, leather chairs, documents spread across polished surfaces. Several political leaders sat around the table. Some I recognized from the real world. Others looked unfamiliar, but their expressions were tense. Stacks of contracts lay before them. Men in expensive suits stood nearby, explaining terms in quiet voices. They spoke about investment, about development, about partnership. But I noticed something else. One by one, the leaders at the table began signing the documents. Each signature seemed small, just a pen touching paper. Yet as each name was written, the room grew heavier. Then the vision shifted again. Suddenly I saw what those signatures truly meant. The contracts were not simple agreements for infrastructure. Hidden deep inside the pages were clauses that transferred control of valuable resources. Gold fields in Ghana, cobalt reserves in Congo, uranium deposits in Niger. Each agreement gave outside financial institutions long-term rights to manage, extract, and profit from those resources. In return, certain leaders received something else: large transfers of money, private accounts, political backing, promises of protection. The vision revealed something painful. Some leaders were not signing for the benefit of their people. They were signing for themselves. And every signature pushed Africa deeper into a system it did not truly control. I felt a deep sadness watching that vision, because leadership should be about protecting the future of your nation. But in that moment, I saw leaders trading that future away piece by piece. The second vision slowly dissolved into light. But the third vision arrived almost immediately. And this one disturbed me the most. Now I found myself inside a different kind of room. It was elegant, Tall windows overlooked a city skyline filled with skyscrapers. A long table stood in the center of the room. Around it sat groups of financial executives, advisors, and investors. Their suits were perfectly tailored, their voices calm. On the table before them lay several large maps. I stepped closer in the vision and saw what those maps showed. They were detailed maps of Africa. But they were not maps of cities or cultures. They were maps of resources. Colored markings highlighted regions rich in minerals, oil, and agricultural potential. Gold deposits, rare earth metals, energy corridors, shipping routes. But there was something else drawn across the maps. Lines, long transportation routes stretching across the continent, highways, railways, logistics corridors. The same highway we had discussed earlier appeared again on the map, but now it was labeled differently. It was not described as Africa's highway. Instead, it was marked as part of a global supply network, a system designed to move resources quickly from extraction zones to international markets. As the executives around the table discussed these plans, some of them smiled. One man tapped the map with his finger. He spoke about how controlling transportation infrastructure allowed them to control the movement of entire economies. Another spoke about long-term debt agreements that would keep nations tied to financial systems for decades. Someone else mentioned expected revenue from toll operations and logistics fees once the highway became operational. Their conversation was calm, almost casual, yet it carried enormous consequences. Because in their discussion, Africa was not being treated as a partner. It was being treated as a resource field connected by transport lines. The people living across that continent were not part of their calculations, only the movement of goods, only the flow of money, only the control of infrastructure. As the executives continued speaking, I noticed something unsettling. Some of them were laughing, not loudly, but enough that it felt deeply disrespectful. They spoke about billions of dollars in profit while millions of Africans continue struggling with poverty. In that moment, the entire room seemed to shrink. The map of Africa lay on the table like a game board, and the men around it moved pieces as if they were planning strategies in a quiet competition. The vision ended slowly. The room faded. The light returned. And once again, I stood before Jesus. He looked at me with the same calm but serious expression. I understood now why he had shown me those visions. Because the highway we had been promised as a symbol of development might not belong to Africa at all. It might become a pathway for something else, something far more complicated, something far more dangerous. But the message was not finished yet, because what Jesus said next would guide every decision I made after that night. When the third vision faded, the room of light returned to silence. I stood there for a moment, trying to understand everything I had just seen. The highway that had looked so promising earlier that day now appeared very different in my mind. It was no longer just a road. It was a system that could move wealth, control trade, and shape the economic future of an entire continent. Jesus stood before me, calm and unmoving. The light around him remained steady, almost like a quiet sunrise that never fades. For a few seconds, he said nothing, but the silence itself felt meaningful. It gave me time to think, to reflect, to feel the weight of the visions that had just passed before my eyes. Finally, he spoke again. His voice carried the same calm strength as before. Leadership, he said, is not measured by the promises that are offered to you. His words were slow, deliberate. It is measured by the consequences that follow your decisions. Those words settled into my heart. Because every leader knows the moment when a decision becomes irreversible, the moment when a signature placed on paper cannot be taken back. Jesus looked directly at me as he continued. As a leader, you must learn to see beyond the surface of every agreement, every contract, every promise, every offer of prosperity, because behind every signature lies a future. His voice remained gentle, but the meaning was powerful. In that moment, I understood something clearly. Development is not always what it appears to be. Sometimes projects presented as opportunities can carry hidden conditions. Conditions that may not be visible during the first conversation. Conditions buried deep inside financial structures, operational agreements, or long-term concessions. Jesus raised his hand slightly. The light around us shifted again, but this time no new visions appeared. Instead, the space seemed to fill with a quiet sense of urgency. He spoke once more. Be careful with the forces that surround power. Be careful with those who offer solutions too quickly. Be careful with the plans that promise prosperity but demand control. Each sentence felt like a warning that stretched beyond the single project we had discussed that day. It felt like a warning about leadership itself, about the responsibility that rests on the shoulders of anyone trusted to guide a nation. Then he spoke the words that stayed with me long after I woke from that dream. Because after every signature, Ibrahim, it is not only your reputation that is affected, it is the future of your people, the future of generations who may never know your name. For a moment, I felt the full weight of those words. When leaders make decisions involving billions of dollars, they are not only managing numbers, they are shaping schools that may or may not be built, hospitals that may or may not appear, opportunities that may either grow or disappear for children who are still too young to understand politics. Jesus looked at me again, and in his eyes I saw something that felt like both warning and encouragement. A wise leader does not rush toward promises. He said, a wise leader searches for truth. Then the light around him began to fade, not suddenly, but gradually, like the slow dimming of the sun at the end of a long day. Before the vision disappeared completely, he spoke one final sentence. Look carefully, ask questions, and protect the future entrusted to you. The moment those words ended, the light vanished. And I woke up. The room was dark again. The quiet hotel room in Washington had returned. For several seconds, I remained still, sitting upright in the bed. My heart was beating faster than normal. The clock beside the bed showed that it was still early in the morning. The city outside the window remained silent. At first, I wondered if the dream had simply been the result of exhaustion. After all, the day had been filled with intense discussions, complicated financial presentations, and the pressure of representing my country. But something inside me refused to dismiss the experience so easily. The dream had felt too clear, too detailed, too meaningful. Every image remained vivid in my mind. The highway surrounded by poverty, the leaders signing contracts they barely understood, the executives studying Africa's resources like pieces on a board, and the warning that every signature could shape the future of millions. I knew one thing for certain. I could not ignore what I had seen. That morning, as the first light of dawn appeared over Washington, I made a decision. Before any agreement would be signed, before any commitments would be made, we needed to look deeper, much deeper. And that decision would lead to a meeting that changed everything. When the sun rose over Washington that morning, I had already been awake for hours. The dream had left my mind restless. I tried to approach it with the calm reasoning that every leader must practice. Dreams, after all, can sometimes reflect nothing more than stress or fatigue. The previous day had been filled with heavy discussions, complicated financial charts, and enormous promises about the future of Africa. But the images I had seen during the night would not fade. The highway surrounded by poverty, the contracts being signed in secret, the executives studying Africa's resources while speaking about control, those images remained as clear in my mind as if I had witnessed them with my own eyes. I stood by the window of the hotel room looking down at the city streets far below. Washington, D.C. is a city built on institutions and decisions that have shaped much of the modern world. Cars moved steadily along wide avenues. Government buildings stood silent in the early morning light. I could not help thinking about how infrastructure had helped build the strength of nations like the United States. But I also knew that infrastructure, when controlled by others, could become a tool of dependency rather than development. By the time the morning meetings began at the IMF headquarters, I had already made up my mind. Before Burkina Faso could support such a massive agreement, we needed to examine the details much more carefully. The presentations from the previous day had focused heavily on economic projections and benefits, but there had been very little discussion about the deeper financial structures behind the project. That alone raised questions. Later that morning, I began speaking privately with several African representatives who had attended the meeting. At first, the conversations were cautious. Many leaders were still enthusiastic about the proposal, and to be fair, the promise of such a massive infrastructure network was difficult to dismiss. Africa had waited generations for projects of that scale. But when I asked whether anyone had carefully reviewed the long-term operational agreements or financial conditions attached to the highway, the answers were less confident. Some advisors admitted they had only received preliminary summaries. Others said that the full contracts were still under review by technical teams. A few leaders quietly acknowledged that the complexity of the financial arrangements made it difficult to fully understand the long-term consequences. Those conversations confirmed something important. We were being asked to consider a project worth nearly $100 billion, yet many of the details remained unclear. By midday, I reached out to several heads of state and senior ministers from across the continent. I proposed that we organize a broader discussion involving African leaders themselves before any formal commitments were made. The idea was simple. Africa needed to evaluate the proposal together, not only through presentations from international financial institutions, but through independent analysis conducted by our own experts. Within days, arrangements were made for a special meeting to take place at the headquarters of the African Union. The location would be Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. For those unfamiliar, Addis Ababa is often considered the diplomatic heart of Africa. The African Union headquarters stands there as a symbol of continental cooperation. When we gathered there, the mood was very different from the excitement we had felt in Washington. This time, the atmosphere was serious, concerned, focused. Leaders, ministers, economic advisors, and infrastructure specialists from multiple African nations filled the conference hall, The goal was not to reject the highway project immediately. The goal was to understand it fully. I remember standing before the room as the discussion began. For a moment, I hesitated, because what I was about to say might sound unusual in such a formal setting. But honesty demanded that I speak openly. So I told them about the dream, not as a prophecy, not as a command, but as something that had stirred a deep sense of caution within me. Some people in the room listened quietly. Others exchanged curious looks. But no one dismissed the concern outright. Because in Africa, faith and leadership often walk together. Many leaders in that room were people who believe that God sometimes speaks through moments that cannot easily be explained. After sharing the experience, I returned the discussion to practical matters. Dream or no dream? We needed facts. We needed transparency. We needed to examine every document connected to the proposed project. And so we agreed to launch a thorough investigation. Economic specialists from several African nations began reviewing the financial models used in the proposal. Legal experts examined the draft contracts and concession agreements. Infrastructure planners evaluated the operational structures that would govern the highway once construction was completed. We also decided to review the financial flows connected to the early preparation stages of the project. Major infrastructure developments usually require large planning budgets long before construction begins. Those funds pay for feasibility studies, environmental assessments, engineering designs, and logistical planning. If anything unusual had occurred during those early stages, it could reveal important information. For several days, our teams worked carefully through the documents. The process was slow. The paperwork connected to a project of that magnitude filled thousands of pages. Loan structures, risk guarantees, operational management agreements, revenue sharing models. Everything had to be examined. During that time, I felt both hopeful and uneasy. Hopeful that the project might still prove beneficial, uneasy that the warning from the dream might reveal something hidden. Then, after several days of analysis, one of the financial review teams approached the leadership committee with troubling news. They had discovered something that did not make sense. A large amount of money connected to the early planning funds could not be clearly accounted for. The number was enormous. More than $2 billion. The funds had been designated for early project preparation. Yet large portions of that money appeared to have moved through financial channels without clear documentation explaining where it had gone. At first, we assumed there might simply be administrative errors. Large international projects often involve complicated financial transfers. But the deeper the investigators looked, the more troubling the situation became. The missing funds appeared to be connected to several intermediary accounts associated with regional political figures and financial consultants. The situation demanded immediate attention. If billions of dollars could disappear before construction had even begun, what might happen once the full project was underway? An internal investigation was launched immediately. Financial records were traced, bank transfers were analyzed, communications between certain officials and international advisors were reviewed, and eventually the investigation led us to a name that none of us had expected, a powerful political figure from Central Africa, a man whose influence had quietly extended into several regional development discussions. His name was Jean-Claude Mbala. What we would soon learn from him would reveal just how dangerous the situation had become. When the name Jean-Claude Mbala first appeared in the investigation reports, many of us in the room looked at each other in silence. Mbala was not an unknown figure. He was a senior political leader from the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country that holds some of the richest mineral deposits on earth. Over the years, he had participated in several regional development discussions and international forums. In many circles, he was considered an experienced negotiator. Because of that reputation, few people initially suspected him of wrongdoing. But the financial investigators who had been tracing the missing funds insisted that the data could not be ignored. According to the records they had uncovered, a series of financial transfers linked to the early preparation phase of the highway project had passed through several intermediary accounts connected to individuals close to Mbala's office. At first, the pattern looked confusing. Money had moved through consulting firms, development, advisory groups, and infrastructure planning partnerships. Each transfer appeared to have a technical explanation on the surface. But when investigators began mapping the transactions step by step, a clearer picture started to emerge. Roughly $2.1 billion had been allocated to early feasibility studies, engineering preparations, and administrative coordination for the highway corridor. Yet large portions of that money had flowed into accounts that were not connected to legitimate project work. Some of the funds had moved through private consulting groups that existed only on paper. Others had been transferred to offshore financial institutions where ownership records were difficult to trace. And again, the trail led back to individuals connected to Mbala. The discovery sent a wave of tension through the meeting hall in Addis Ababa. Because if the information proved accurate, it meant something deeply troubling. The project had not even begun construction, yet billions of dollars were already disappearing. For several hours, the room remained filled with intense discussion. Legal advisors explained that accusing a senior political figure required clear evidence. Economic experts emphasized the importance of protecting the credibility of the investigation, but the financial records could not be ignored. Eventually, the decision was made to confront the situation directly. Jean-Claude Mbala was formally invited to appear before the investigative committee of the African Union. The message sent to him was clear but respectful. There were financial irregularities connected to the preparation funds of the Trans-Africa Highway project. Clarification was required. When Mbala arrived in Addis Ababa several days later, the atmosphere inside the meeting room was heavy with anticipation. I remember the moment he walked through the doors. He appeared calm. His posture was confident, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. The committee consisted of multiple African leaders, financial investigators, legal experts, and representatives from several regional economic organizations. This was not a public courtroom, but the questions being asked carried enormous consequences. At first, Mbala spoke carefully. He described his involvement in regional development discussions. He explained that he had participated in conversations about how the highway corridor could strengthen trade routes across Central Africa. He emphasized that large infrastructure projects often involve complicated financial arrangements and advisory services. Some of his explanations sounded reasonable. But as the investigators began presenting detailed records of the financial transfers, the tone of the meeting slowly changed. Documents were placed on the table. Bank transfer summaries, corporate ownership charts, communication records. One by one, the investigators explained how funds had moved through specific accounts connected to companies that had little or no evidence of performing actual project work. The room grew quiet as the information was presented. Mbala listened without interrupting. At one point, he leaned forward in his chair and asked to review one of the financial charts more closely. Several minutes passed in silence as he studied the documents. Then something unexpected happened. His shoulders lowered slightly. The confident expression he had carried into the room faded. And when he finally spoke again, his voice sounded different, slower, more measured. He did not deny the financial transfers. Instead, he began explaining how the situation had developed. What he revealed in the hours that followed would expose a much deeper problem than anyone in that room had imagined. Because according to Mbala, the missing funds were not simply the result of personal corruption. They were part of a larger strategy designed to push the highway project forward as quickly as possible. A strategy supported by powerful financial interests outside the continent. And as he continued speaking, the truth behind the highway proposal began to emerge piece by piece. The room in Addis Ababa had grown completely silent. Jean-Claude Mbala sat at the long table, surrounded by leaders, investigators, and advisors from across Africa. The documents in front of him told a story that could no longer be easily dismissed. For several minutes, he remained quiet, studying the financial charts that had been placed before him. Then he slowly placed the papers back on the table. His eyes moved around the room, meeting the gaze of several leaders seated nearby. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a heaviness that had not been present earlier. "I will tell you the truth," he said. The words were simple, but in that moment, everyone in the room understood that something important was about to be revealed. Mbala leaned back slightly in his chair and took a long breath. He began by explaining how the conversations around the Trans-Africa Highway Corridor had started long before the meeting we attended in Washington. According to him, discussions about large transportation corridors across Africa had been taking place for years within certain international financial circles. Major development banks, global investment groups, and infrastructure consortiums had been studying the continent's logistics networks very carefully. They understood something that many people outside Africa often overlook. Africa's greatest economic limitation was not the lack of resources. It was the lack of efficient transportation infrastructure. Without reliable highways, railways, and shipping networks, moving goods across the continent remained slow and expensive. Whoever controlled those transportation routes could influence the movement of entire economies. Mbala explained that several international financial groups had been quietly developing plans to finance major infrastructure corridors across Africa. But financing alone was not their main objective. In order to secure control over these corridors, they needed agreements that would give them long-term operational authority over the infrastructure once it was built. That meant decades of management rights, decades of toll collection, decades of influence over how goods moved across the continent. Mbala paused for a moment before continuing. The highway itself was never the real prize, he said quietly. The control of the highway was. The words hung in the air. Several leaders exchanged uneasy glances. Mbala then described how he first became involved. A few years earlier, he had been approached by a group of financial consultants representing international infrastructure investors. At first, the discussions seemed harmless. They asked for his insights about political conditions across Central Africa. They asked about regional cooperation between governments. They asked which leaders might support large development projects that promised economic growth. Over time, the conversations became more specific. They began discussing the possibility of a massive highway corridor stretching across the continent. They described it as a historic opportunity that could transform Africa's economy. But then they began asking for something else. They wanted help building political support for the project among African governments. They wanted leaders to approve the proposal quickly, before too many questions were asked, before too many independent reviews could slow the process. Mbala admitted that at first he had resisted. He told the committee that he understood how sensitive such a project could be. But the pressure from those groups grew stronger over time. Then came the offer. According to Mbala, representatives from several financial networks promised to transfer $180 million into accounts he controlled. In addition to the money, they also promised something many politicians find difficult to refuse: political support. They assured him that their global connections could help strengthen his position within regional politics. They could influence investment flows. They could support diplomatic relationships. In other words, they offered both wealth and power. In return, they asked for one thing: speed. They wanted the highway agreement signed as quickly as possible. They wanted the proposal presented to African leaders as an urgent opportunity that could not be delayed. They wanted enthusiasm, excitement, momentum, and Mbala admitted that eventually he accepted their offer. He began quietly encouraging support for the project in various political discussions. He spoke about the economic benefits. He emphasized the promise of job creation. He helped arrange meetings between international financial institutions and regional leaders. Many of the claims he made were not technically false. The highway could indeed reduce transportation costs. It could indeed create jobs during construction. But the deeper financial structures behind the project were not being openly discussed. As Mbala continued speaking, the atmosphere in the room became heavier, because what he was describing was not just personal corruption. It was a coordinated effort to push a massive financial agreement forward before its long-term consequences were fully understood. Then Mbala revealed something that caused several leaders to lean forward in their chairs. He explained that the $2.1 billion that investigators had traced through suspicion accounts was not entirely meant for him. A large portion of that money had been used to influence multiple intermediaries across different political networks: consultants, lobbyists, advisors, individuals who could help shape the narrative around the highway project. The goal had been to create an environment where African leaders felt enormous pressure to approve the project quickly. Because if enough leaders believed that everyone else supported the plan, resistance would become more difficult. It was a strategy based on momentum, and it had nearly worked. Mbala lowered his voice as he finished explaining his role. "I believe the highway could still benefit Africa," he said. "But I also believed the system behind it was too powerful to resist." Those words echoed across the room. For a moment, no one spoke. The realization was sinking in. Africa had been offered a project worth nearly $100 billion, a project described as the key to economic transformation. Yet hidden behind the promises were financial structures designed to place control of that infrastructure in the hands of outside institutions for decades. The investigation was far from over, because the confession had revealed something even more troubling. The highway would not truly belong to Africa once it was completed, and the details of that control were written directly into the contracts we had nearly signed. After Jean-Claude Mbala finished describing how the financial networks had pushed the project forward, the room remained silent for several moments. Many of us were still processing what we had just heard. The missing money had already been troubling enough. But the deeper issue was now becoming clearer. If powerful investors had worked so aggressively to accelerate the project, then the structure of the agreement itself deserved even closer examination. So the investigation continued. Legal advisors began studying the draft contracts that had been circulated during the Washington meetings. These were long documents filled with technical language, financial clauses, and operational provisions that could easily escape the attention of someone reading them quickly. At first glance, the agreements appeared normal. They described the responsibilities of construction companies, timelines for building various sections of the highway, and procedures for maintaining the road after completion. But as the lawyers and economic specialists studied the details more carefully, they began to notice something significant. The project was not structured as a simple construction partnership. It was structured as a long-term concession. That difference changed everything. Under a concession model, the institutions financing the highway would not simply help build the road and then transfer ownership to the African nations involved. Instead, those institutions would retain operational control for decades. One legal advisor stood up during the meeting and read directly from one of the contract sections. According to the agreement, once the highway corridor was completed, a consortium of international financial groups would manage and operate the road network for 40 years, nearly half a century. During that time, they would have authority over toll collection, freight access, and maintenance contracts. They would determine the pricing structure for vehicles traveling along the highway. They would oversee the logistics systems that coordinated the movement of cargo. And perhaps most importantly, they would control the revenue generated by that infrastructure. Several economic analysts began running quick calculations based on the expected traffic volumes that had been presented in Washington. The numbers were staggering. The proposal included plans to build more than 120 toll stations along the corridor. Each station would collect fees from trucks, commercial vehicles, and long-distance transport carriers using the highway. Because the road would connect major trade routes across the continent, it was expected to carry enormous volumes of cargo, mining shipments, agricultural exports, industrial goods, fuel transport. Everything moving from west to east across Africa could potentially pass through that network. The financial projections estimated that the toll system alone could generate billions of dollars in revenue every year. But here was the critical point. That revenue would not go directly to the African nations whose land the highway crossed. Instead, it would first flow to the international consortium managing the project. Those funds would be used to repay the original loans, cover operational costs, and deliver returns to investors. Only after those obligations were satisfied would any remaining revenue be shared with participating governments. And according to the financial models attached to the proposal, the early decades of operation would generate very little surplus revenue for the African nations involved. In other words, Africa would host the highway, but the economic control of that highway would belong to others. The more our experts examined the contract, the more concerning details appeared. The agreement also included clauses allowing the operating consortium to restrict access to certain sections of the highway if financial obligations were not met. That meant if any participating nation failed to meet its repayment schedule, parts of the corridor running through its territory could fall under stricter external control. Some advisors described the system as a logistical gate, a gate positioned directly across Africa's internal trade routes. Another clause allowed the operating consortium to adjust toll prices periodically based on market conditions and revenue targets. This meant transportation costs across the corridor could increase over time without direct approval from the governments whose land the highway crossed. The deeper we looked, the clearer the picture became. The highway had been presented as a development project, but the financial structure behind it resembled something else entirely. It resembled a long-term control mechanism over Africa's most important trade routes. One economic advisor explained it in simple terms during the meeting. If you control the road, he said, you control the movement of goods. And if you control the movement of goods, you control the economy built around that movement. Those words stayed with me because they connected directly to the third vision I had seen in the dream. The executives gathered around a table studying maps of Africa's resources, the lines drawn across the continent, the transportation corridors that could carry wealth outward for decades. For a moment, I imagined the highway again, not as the glowing line on a presentation screen in Washington, but as a living system stretching across thousands of kilometers of African land, a road filled with trucks carrying minerals, crops, and manufactured goods. Yet each vehicle passing through toll stations controlled by institutions outside the continent. Each shipment generating revenue that flowed first into financial systems far away. The realization was difficult to ignore. If the contracts had been signed exactly as they were written, Africa might have built the most advanced highway network in its history. But it would not truly own that network. The infrastructure would physically exist on African soil, yet the financial and operational authority behind it would remain elsewhere for decades. The room in Addis Ababa became increasingly tense as these conclusions were discussed. Some leaders expressed anger. Others expressed disbelief that such terms had been presented without clearer explanation. But everyone agreed on one point. The investigation had revealed something serious, something that required immediate decisions. Because if the project moved forward without changes, Africa might be entering a system that will shape its economic future for generations. And we still had not examined the final element of the proposal. The financing structure, the loans, the interest rates, the long-term debt obligations that would follow construction. What we would soon discover about those financial conditions would make the situation even more dangerous. By the time we reached this stage of the investigation, the atmosphere in Addis Ababa had changed completely from the optimism we had once felt in Washington. What had begun as excitement about development was slowly turning into a careful examination of risk. The highway project was still impressive in scale. No one denied that. A modern transportation corridor stretching across thousands of kilometers could transform trade, reduce travel time, and connect regions of Africa that had remained isolated for generations. But infrastructure alone does not determine whether a project truly benefits a nation. The financial structure behind that infrastructure often matters even more. And it was the financing structure of the Trans-Africa Highway Corridor that demanded the most serious attention. Our financial analysts began reviewing the loan agreements connected to the project. The proposal described the initial investment of $92 billion as development assistance. But when the detailed documents were examined more closely, a different reality appeared. The majority of that money was not a grant. It was a loan, a very large loan, one that participating African nations would be responsible for repaying over several decades. At first, this might not sound unusual. Many countries borrow money to build infrastructure. Roads, ports, railways, and airports are often financed through long-term loans because the projects themselves can generate economic growth over time. But the specific terms of these loans raised serious questions. According to the draft agreements, the participating African nations would collectively assume responsibility for the debt required to construct the highway. The interest rate attached to those loans was listed at approximately 5.8% annually. For a project of that scale, the difference between a low interest rate and a higher one becomes enormous over time. Several economists in the room began calculating the long-term cost if the full $92 billion were borrowed under those conditions. The interest payments alone would grow rapidly over the decades. When maintenance costs, operational expenses, and inflation adjustments were added to the equation, the total financial obligation became staggering. One analyst summarized the projection clearly. Over the course of 30 years, the combined debt obligations connected to the highway corridor could reach nearly $130 billion. The room fell quiet when that number was spoken, because it meant something very important. Africa would not simply be hosting a highway. Africa would be paying for it for generations. And remember, during those same decades, the operational control of the road would remain in the hands of the international consortium managing the concession, so the situation became clear. African nations would carry the long-term debt, but the operational revenue from the highway would first be used to repay investors and loan providers. Only after those financial obligations were satisfied would additional profits be distributed more broadly. One economic advisor compared the structure to a household borrowing money to build a house. But after the house is built, someone else owns the keys and collects rent from the rooms. You continue paying the mortgage, but you do not control how the property is used. That comparison may sound simple, yet it captured the problem perfectly. The financial model placed enormous risk on the African nations involved. If traffic volumes along the highway failed to meet the projections presented in Washington, toll revenues could fall short of expectations. If maintenance costs rose unexpectedly, operational expenses could increase. If political instability disrupted trade routes, freight traffic might decrease. In any of those scenarios, the revenue from the highway might not be sufficient to cover the debt obligations. And when that happens in large infrastructure projects, the consequences can be severe. Debt restructuring, asset control transfers, long-term concessions extended even further. Some economists in the room pointed out that similar situations had occurred in various parts of the world where large infrastructure projects were financed under aggressive loan conditions. When countries struggled to meet repayment schedules, control of strategic assets sometimes shifted toward the creditors. Ports, railways, energy facilities, transportation corridors. The possibility that such a scenario could happen with a highway stretching across multiple African nations was deeply concerning. Another issue also emerged during the financial review: the maintenance and operational costs of a highway network that long would be extremely high. Road surfaces require constant repair. Bridges must be inspected and reinforced. Security systems must operate across thousands of kilometers. According to the documents, the consortium managing the highway will charge annual maintenance and operational fees as part of the concession structure. Those costs were expected to rise gradually over time, which meant that even if the debt repayments remained stable, the long-term financial burden could still increase year after year. By this point, many leaders in the room were beginning to understand why the investors behind the project had been so eager to secure quick approval. The highway itself was not simply a development initiative. It was part of a complex financial system designed to generate revenue streams for decades. Revenue streams supported by African debt and protected by contractual control over the infrastructure itself. One leader from West Africa leaned forward during the meeting and spoke quietly but firmly. If we sign this exactly as it stands, he said, we may build a road across Africa. But that road may carry our wealth away for generations. His words reflected the concern that was now spreading across the room. Because development should empower nations. It should strengthen independence. It should expand opportunity for future generations. But if development is financed in a way that creates long-term dependency, then that can become the opposite of progress. It can become a trap made not of chains or walls, but of contracts, interest payments, and decades of financial obligation. The realization was sobering. We had nearly committed to a project that promised transformation. Yet hidden within the financial structures were risks that could shape Africa's economic freedom for decades. And so the leaders gathered in Addis Ababa faced an important question. What should Africa do next? By the time the investigation reached its final stage, the atmosphere in the African Union headquarters had become heavy with responsibility. For days, we had listened to financial analysts, legal experts, infrastructure engineers, and economic advisors. Every page of the contract had been examined. Every financial structure had been discussed. Every projection had been questioned. What had once looked like a simple development proposal now appeared far more complicated. The highway itself still had the potential to transform Africa's transportation network. No one doubted that. But the structure surrounding it carried risks that could not be ignored. Debt obligations stretching for decades. Operational control held by external financial groups. Revenue systems designed to prioritize investor returns before national benefit. And the troubling discovery that billions of dollars had already moved through questionable financial channels even before construction began. When the final briefing concluded, the room became very quiet. Around the large conference table sat leaders from across the continent. Each of us understood that the decision we made in that room could shape Africa's economic future for generations. I looked around at the faces of men and women who carry the hopes of millions of people back home. Farmers who work the land every day. Young students dreaming about opportunities. Families hoping that the next generation might live better than the last. Leadership sometimes requires courage in moments when the world expects quick answers. But wisdom often requires patience. One by one, several leaders began speaking. Some expressed frustration that such a massive project had been presented without full transparency. Others emphasized that Africa still desperately needed infrastructure development. No one wanted to reject progress, but no one wanted to accept a system that might weaken our independence either. One senior minister from East Africa stood and spoke calmly to the room. "We must remember something important," he said. "A road is not development by itself. Development comes from how that road is owned, managed, and used by the people it is meant to serve." His words reflected what many of us were thinking. If the highway truly belonged to Africa, it could strengthen trade and opportunity across the continent. But if the highway belonged to financial systems outside our control, it might become something very different. A channel through which wealth flowed outward while debt remained behind. The discussion continued late into the evening. Several proposals were considered. Some leaders suggested renegotiating the terms of the contracts to ensure that African nations maintain full operational control after construction. Others recommended breaking the project into smaller regional segments so that individual nations could manage their own infrastructure investments. A few advisors proposed developing the highway through African financial institutions and regional investment partnerships rather than relying entirely on global lenders. Eventually, the direction became clear. Before any agreement could proceed, the current proposal would need to be paused. The leaders agreed that the project, as it had been presented, could not move forward under the existing conditions. The decision was not made out of anger. It was made out of caution and responsibility. A formal resolution was drafted that evening. The Trans-Africa Highway Corridor Agreement would be temporarily suspended. A special investigative committee under the African Union would continue examining the financial structures connected to the project. All draft contracts would be made subject to greater transparency, and perhaps most importantly, African nations would begin exploring ways to develop infrastructure using more independent financial strategies. The goal was not to reject cooperation with international partners. Africa has always benefited from collaboration with the global community. But collaboration must be based on fairness, on mutual respect, on agreements that strengthen independence rather than weaken it. When the final decision was announced in the room, I felt a mixture of emotions, relief, concern, and a deep awareness of how close we had come to making a decision that might have been difficult to reverse. Later that night, as I left the African Union building, the streets of Addis Ababa were quiet. The cool evening air carried the distant sounds of the city settling into rest. I paused for a moment before entering the car that would take me back to my residence. And I thought again about the dream that had started this entire chain of events, the three visions, the warning about signatures, the reminder that leadership requires seeing beyond promises. Perhaps some people would say that dream was simply the imagination of a tired mind. Perhaps others would believe it was something more. But what mattered most was the result, because the investigation had revealed truths that might otherwise have remained hidden. Africa had avoided stepping into an agreement that required deeper understanding, and now the continent had an opportunity to rethink how its future infrastructure could be built, not through fear, not through haste, but through wisdom and through unity, because the real lesson of this story was not about a single highway project. It was about something larger, something every nation must remember when facing promises of development. And that lesson would become one of the most important reflections of my leadership. When I think back on those days in Washington and Addis Ababa, I often remind myself how close history can come to turning in the wrong direction. Sometimes the difference between wisdom and regret is only a few signatures on a document. Leadership carries a strange burden. The world often sees presidents and ministers as powerful figures, yet in truth, we spend many nights wondering whether the decisions we make today will help or harm people we may never meet. The farmer working a dry field in Burkina Faso, the young student in Ghana dreaming about becoming an engineer, the truck driver crossing the desert roads of Chad hoping to bring food to his family. Every contract signed in a quiet conference room eventually reaches lives like theirs. That is why the events surrounding the Trans-Africa Highway Corridor became such a powerful lesson for me. Not a lesson about rejecting development. Africa desperately needs development. Our continent needs roads, railways, schools, hospitals, and modern energy systems. We need trade networks that allow African nations to grow together instead of remaining isolated from one another. But what we must remember is that development is not defined by the size of a project. Development is defined by ownership. If a road is built but its power belongs elsewhere, then the people who live beside that road may still remain poor. If a nation borrows money but loses control of its resources, then the promise of growth may slowly become a chain of debt. True progress must strengthen freedom, not weaken it. That is the lesson many African leaders carried home after the investigation ended. Across the continent, new conversations began taking place. Economists started discussing how African investment funds could play a larger role in infrastructure development. Regional development banks began exploring partnerships that would allow African nations to finance more of their own projects. Young engineers and planners started imagining transportation systems designed first for the needs of African communities rather than for global extraction networks. None of this will happen overnight. Building a continent is a long journey. But the most important step is always the first moment when people decide they must walk their own path. For me personally, the experience also strengthened something that had guided me since childhood: faith. I do not claim that dreams alone should guide national decisions. A responsible leader must rely on evidence, experts, and careful analysis. But faith reminds us to pause, to question, to look beyond the surface of things. Sometimes wisdom comes through quiet reflection, sometimes through the advice of others, and sometimes through moments that arrive when we least expect them. That night in Washington, I saw a vision that forced me to ask deeper questions. But the real strength of the story was not the dream itself. It was the response that followed. African leaders chose to investigate rather than rush. They chose transparency instead of secrecy. They chose unity instead of pressure. And because of that, a continent avoided stepping blindly into an agreement that deserved far more careful thought. Today, when I travel across Burkina Faso, I still see the challenges our people face. Rural roads that need improvement, young people searching for opportunity, communities hoping that the future will be better than the past. Those realities remind me that the work of leadership is far from finished. Africa still needs great roads. Africa still needs bold ideas. But those ideas must come from a place of integrity, from leaders who understand that power is temporary, but the consequences of their decisions can last for generations. If there is one message I will share with the world, especially with those who believe in faith and moral leadership, it is this: a nation's future should never be traded for quick promises. Every leader must look beyond the excitement of opportunity and ask a simple question: who truly benefits? Because sometimes the most dangerous agreements are not the ones that appear threatening. They are the ones that appear generous. That lesson is not only for Africa. It is for every country, every community, and every person who holds responsibility over the lives of others. The world today moves quickly. Financial systems span continents. Decisions made in one city can shape the destiny of millions across oceans. In such a world, integrity becomes more important than ever. Honesty, transparency, faith, and courage. These are not just spiritual values. They are practical foundations for wise leadership. As I finish telling this story, I think about the people who may be listening to these words. Perhaps you are sitting in a quiet home somewhere in America. Perhaps you are someone who has spent many years studying leadership, faith, and the moral challenges faced by those in power. If this story speaks to you, I invite you to reflect on it, not simply as a political account, but as a reminder that truth and wisdom must guide every decision that shapes the future of humanity. And if you believe that stories like this matter, stories about faith, responsibility, and the difficult choices leaders must make, then I hope you will continue following conversations like this one. Share your thoughts, share your perspective. Because sometimes the wisdom of a community can guide the path of a nation. As for me, I remain committed to the responsibility entrusted to me by the people of Burkina Faso. And I will end with a statement that I repeat not out of pride, but out of duty. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. The words I've spoken to you today come from truth and from responsibility. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. The story I have shared is told in honesty and in faith. I am Ibrahim Traore, President of Burkina Faso. And everything you have heard here is spoken with the sincerity of a leader who believes that truth must always stand above power,